Right now, as you watch this, you are either chasing something you believe will finally give you peace, or desperately trying to hold on to something you fear losing. And deep down, in a place you rarely visit, you know that this constant chase is exhausting you. You know that even when you get what you want, the satisfaction lasts only days, maybe weeks, before the hunger returns, more intense than before. I am Solomon, and I have stood where you stand now. I have had everything a man could desire, and I have lost everything a man could fear losing. But what I discovered in those moments of loss changed not just my wealth, but my very soul. You see, there is a secret that the wealthy rarely speak about, and the poor refuse to believe. Sometimes, when prosperity slips through your fingers like water, when opportunities vanish just as you are about to seize them, when everything seems to conspire against your success, it is not the universe punishing you. It is God Himself protecting you from becoming a prisoner of your own ambitions. Today, I will reveal to you why the Almighty withdraws prosperity from some men, and how this apparent curse is actually the greatest mercy you could receive. This is not about learning new techniques to make money. This is about transforming from a man who fears losing everything into a man who understands that true wealth cannot be taken from him. If you have been wondering why your efforts do not bear the fruit you expected, if you feel that invisible forces work against your progress, then this message was written for you, because what you are about to discover will not just change your relationship with money, it will change who you are. This is the moment when you stop being a slave to prosperity and become its master, but only if you are ready to hear a truth that will shake everything you thought you knew about wealth and purpose. If you are ready for this transformation, then stay with me. And if this message resonates in your spirit, subscribe to this channel, because the wisdom I am about to share comes from the deepest experiences of a man who had everything, lost everything, and found something infinitely more valuable. Number 1. Prosperity slipping through the fingers. Look around you right now. You know men who seem to have everything lined up perfectly. The right connections, the brilliant ideas, the perfect timing. Yet somehow, their prosperity vanishes like morning mist. You watch them struggle, and perhaps you see yourself in their reflection. Perhaps you are that man, wondering why success feels like trying to hold water in your bare hands. I have witnessed this phenomenon across kingdoms and centuries, and I tell you now that what you perceive as cruel fate is often the merciful hand of the Almighty. When prosperity slips through your fingers despite every advantage, it is rarely an accident. It is divine intervention, and understanding this truth will transform how you view every loss, every setback, every moment when success seemed within reach yet disappeared. Picture a man standing in a river of gold. The current flows abundantly around his feet, and all he needs to do is cup his hands to gather wealth. Yet every time he bends down, the precious metal flows through his fingers. He tries desperately, frantically, cursing the river, cursing his hands, cursing fate itself. But what he cannot see is that downstream, the river feeds into a poisonous marsh that would have destroyed him. I remember a merchant in my court, a man of exceptional talent and connections. He could negotiate deals that others could only dream of, and his network spanned from Egypt to Babylon. Every venture he touched should have turned to gold. Yet somehow, at the crucial moment, contracts fell through, partnerships dissolved, opportunities evaporated. He came to me in desperation, convinced that he was cursed, that the gods had abandoned him. But as I observed him closely, I began to see what the Almighty saw. This man's heart was becoming increasingly hardened with each near success. His hunger for wealth was consuming his compassion. His family saw him only as a provider, never as a father or husband. His workers feared him more each day. The prosperity he chased was slowly poisoning the very relationships that gave his life meaning. God was protecting him, though neither he nor I understood it fully at the time. Every door that closed, every deal that failed, was mercy disguised as disappointment. The Almighty saw that if this man achieved the wealth he sought in his current state, it would have destroyed not just him, but everyone he claimed to love. This is the hardest truth for a man to accept, that sometimes our failures are not punishment but protection. We live in a world that measures success by accumulation, that judges worth by wealth, that equates prosperity with divine blessing. But I have learned that the opposite can be true. Sometimes, the withdrawal of prosperity is the greatest blessing God can bestow. When prosperity consistently slips through your fingers, ask yourself this crucial question: what would I become if I achieved everything I desire right now, with the heart I currently possess? Would I become more generous or more selfish? More humble or more arrogant? More connected to others or more isolated by my success? The man who can honestly answer these questions often discovers why his prosperity has been withheld. It is not because he lacks talent, connections, or opportunity. It is because the Almighty, in His infinite wisdom, sees that success achieved too soon, with an unprepared heart, becomes a curse that destroys from within. I have seen princes inherit vast kingdoms only to lose them within years because their character could not sustain their position. I have watched brilliant merchants accumulate fortunes that turned them into monsters their own children feared to approach. The prosperity they gained became the very instrument of their destruction. But here is the hope in this revelation. When you understand that your current struggles may be divine protection, you can use this season of waiting to prepare your heart for the prosperity that will eventually come. Instead of fighting against the river that seems to resist you, you can ask what the Almighty wants to teach you before He opens the floodgates of blessing. This is not about accepting poverty or abandoning ambition. This is about recognizing that true prosperity requires not just external opportunity, but internal readiness. The man whose prosperity keeps slipping away is being offered the greatest gift possible: time to become worthy of what he seeks. When you stop viewing your setbacks as punishment and start seeing them as preparation, everything changes. Your frustration transforms into curiosity. Your desperation becomes patience. Your anger turns into gratitude for a God who loves you too much to give you something that would destroy you. The test is this: can you trust that the one who gave you the desire for prosperity also has the wisdom to know when you are ready to receive it without being destroyed by it? Number 2, the danger of confusing wealth with identity. There is a moment in every man's life when he looks in the mirror and sees his bank account staring back at him, when his worth as a human being has become inseparable from the numbers on his financial statements. If you have ever felt your chest tighten when your investments drop, if you have ever felt personally attacked when someone criticizes the wealthy, if your mood rises and falls with your net worth, then you know exactly what I am speaking about. This is perhaps the most dangerous trap that prosperity can set, and it is one that I fell into myself. When wealth becomes identity, when your sense of self is built upon the foundation of your possessions, you have created an idol so powerful that it will eventually consume everything you hold dear. Think of a man who has spent years building his identity around being successful. His clothes speak of his wealth. His home displays his achievements. His conversations revolve around his acquisitions. He has become so intertwined with his prosperity that he cannot tell where the money ends and he begins. Every financial gain feels like validation of his worth as a person. Every financial loss feels like a personal attack on his very existence. This man lives in constant terror, though he would never admit it. He fears market crashes like other men fear death, because for him, they are the same thing. He defends every dollar as if it were his life, because in his mind, it is. He cannot enjoy his wealth because he is too busy protecting it. Too afraid of losing the very thing that he believes makes him who he is. I was once this man. In the height of my prosperity, I began to see myself as the sum of my treasures, my wisdom, my accomplishments, my relationships, all became secondary to my accumulation of wealth. I thought I was blessed, but I was actually enslaved. I thought I owned my riches, but they owned me completely. The Almighty, seeing this spiritual cancer growing within me, began to introduce uncertainty into my financial world. Not massive losses at first, but small fluctuations that would send waves of anxiety through my entire being. Investments that should have been certain began to waver. Trading routes that had been profitable for years started showing losses. Income streams that seemed permanent began to dry up. At first, I fought these changes with everything I had. I worked longer hours, made more desperate deals, grasped at opportunities with increasing panic. I could not understand why the God who had blessed me with such wealth was now threatening to take it away. I felt abandoned, betrayed, punished for sins I could not identify. But slowly, through these struggles, I began to see the trap I had built around my own soul. My identity had become so fused with my wealth that I had forgotten who I was without it. I was like a man who had worn a mask for so long that he believed it was his actual face. The anxiety I felt was not about money at all. It was about the terrifying possibility that without my wealth, I might discover I was nobody at all. This is why God withdraws prosperity from men who confuse wealth with identity. It is not cruelty, it is surgery. He is cutting away the tumor of false identity before it kills the soul completely. He removes the idol so that the man can rediscover the person he was meant to be, underneath all the accumulation and achievement. The process is excruciating because it feels like dying. And in many ways, it is. The false self that was built on financial success must die so that the true self can emerge. The man who defined himself by what he owned must learn to find his worth in who he is, regardless of what he possesses. I remember the night when this truth finally penetrated my heart. I had lost a significant portion of my wealth in a series of failed ventures, and I found myself sitting in my chambers, stripped of the financial security that had defined me for years. For the first time in decades, I was forced to ask myself the most fundamental question: who am I when I have nothing to show for it? The answer that came was both humbling and liberating. I was still Solomon, the man who sought wisdom, who cared for his people, who wrestled with the deepest questions of existence. My worth was not diminished by my decreased wealth, because my worth had never been dependent on my wealth to begin with. I had simply forgotten this truth in the intoxication of prosperity. When you understand that your identity and your wealth are separate things, everything changes. You can enjoy prosperity without being enslaved by it. You can pursue financial goals without your self-worth hanging in the balance. You can experience losses without feeling like you are losing yourself. But here is the practical wisdom that emerges from this understanding. The man who knows his identity apart from his wealth is actually far more likely to create and maintain prosperity. He makes better decisions because he is not driven by desperation. He takes calculated risks because he is not paralyzed by the fear of losing himself. He attracts opportunities because people sense his security and stability. The irony is that by releasing your grip on wealth as identity, you often become more capable of creating and keeping wealth as a tool. If you find yourself anxious about money, if your mood depends on your financial statements, if you feel personally diminished when your wealth decreases, then God may be preparing to perform this surgery on your soul. He may withdraw some of your prosperity not to punish you, but to free you from the prison you have built around your own identity. The question is not whether you have money, but whether money has you. Number 3. Money used to feed pride or hide wounds. Every man carries wounds, and every man struggles with pride. But the wealthy man faces a unique temptation that can destroy his soul without him even realizing it. He can use his money like medicine, numbing the pain of his deepest hurts, or like a sword, inflicting damage on others to protect his wounded ego. Either way, he becomes an addict, dependent on wealth not for what it can build, but for what it can hide or what it can prove. If you have ever bought something not because you needed it, but because owning it made you feel superior to someone else, you know this trap. If you have ever used your wealth to silence criticism, to buy loyalty, or to avoid facing uncomfortable truths about yourself, then you understand how money can become the most sophisticated emotional anesthetic ever created. I have watched men purchase respect they never earned, admiration they never deserved, and love they never truly received. They build monuments to their own greatness while their hearts remain empty wastelands. They surround themselves with luxury to distract from the poverty of their souls. They use their wealth like armor, protecting themselves from vulnerability, from genuine connection, from the very relationships they need most. Consider the man who grew up poor, mocked by his peers, dismissed by those in power. He carries these wounds like hidden scars, and when prosperity finally comes, he uses it like a weapon of revenge. Every expensive purchase is a statement to those who once looked down on him. Every display of wealth is an attempt to rewrite his history of humiliation. He has confused success with vindication, prosperity with healing. But the wounds remain. No amount of gold can heal rejection that happened in childhood. No luxury can undo the shame of being powerless. The money he spends on proving his worth only reminds him of how worthless he once felt. He becomes trapped in an endless cycle, always needing more wealth to feel whole, never finding the wholeness he seeks. Then there is the man who uses wealth to inflate his sense of importance. He needs to feel superior, to be admired, to be feared and respected. His money becomes a tool for building pedestals on which he can stand above other men. He throws lavish parties not to bring joy, but to display power. He makes charitable donations, not from generosity, but from the need to be seen as significant. This man's pride has made his wealth into a drug, and like all drugs, it requires ever-increasing doses to achieve the same effect. What once impressed others becomes commonplace. What once made him feel important becomes insufficient. He must spend more, acquire more, display more, always chasing a feeling that grows more elusive with every purchase. I have been both of these men at different times in my life. I used my wealth to prove my worth to a father who never seemed satisfied with my achievements. I used my riches to intimidate those who questioned my wisdom. I purchased loyalty from those who should have respected me for who I was, not what I owned. I tried to heal old wounds with new gold, and I tried to feed my pride with the admiration that money could buy. The Almighty saw what I was doing, even when I refused to see it myself. He saw that my wealth, instead of serving me, had enslaved me to my own emotional needs. He watched as I used his blessings to avoid his healing, to hide from his correction, to build walls instead of bridges. So he began to withdraw the very tool I was using to avoid facing my true self. Investments failed not because of market conditions, but because God knew I was using the profits to buy false comfort. Business relationships dissolved not because of external circumstances, but because the Almighty would not allow me to continue purchasing fake respect. Income streams dried up not because of economic downturns, but because my Creator saw that I was using money to avoid the inner work that only poverty could motivate. The withdrawal was painful beyond description. Suddenly, I could no longer buy my way out of discomfort. I could no longer purchase the admiration that fed my pride. I was forced to sit with my wounds, to acknowledge my need for validation, to face the parts of myself that I had been covering with gold. It was in that place of financial vulnerability that I finally began to heal. Without money to mask my pain, I had to learn other ways to find comfort. Without wealth to prop up my pride, I had to discover my actual worth. The very things I had been avoiding, God forced me to confront, and in confronting them, I found the freedom I had been seeking all along. This is why God withdraws prosperity from men who use it to feed pride or hide wounds. He is not punishing the symptom. He is removing the drug so that the real healing can begin. He knows that as long as money can numb the pain or inflate the ego, the man will never do the difficult work of becoming whole. The correction is mercy, disguised as loss. The withdrawal is an invitation to authentic healing. The financial struggle is God's way of saying, I love you too much to let you stay broken, and I will take away whatever prevents you from dealing with what really needs to be healed. Here is what I learned through this process. The man who uses money to prove his worth will never feel worthy, no matter how much he accumulates. The man who uses wealth to avoid his pain will never find peace, no matter how much comfort he can afford. But the man who allows God to strip away these false comforts often discovers that he was always worthy, always valuable, always enough, even without a single coin to prove it. When prosperity returns after this kind of correction, it serves a completely different purpose. It no longer feeds pride because pride has been replaced with genuine confidence. It no longer hides wounds because the wounds have been healed. Instead, it becomes a tool for building, blessing, and serving the way prosperity was always meant to function. If your money has become your medicine or your weapon, if you find yourself using wealth to prove your worth or numb your pain, then prepare your heart for God's loving intervention. He may withdraw what you have been using as a substitute for healing, not to harm you, but to heal you in ways that money never could. The question is not whether you deserve prosperity, but whether prosperity deserves the man you have become. Number 4. Loss as divine protection. There exists a love so profound that it will wound you to save you, that will take away what you want to give you what you need, that will break your plans to fulfill your purpose. This is the love of the Almighty, and when you finally understand it, every loss in your life will be transformed from a source of bitterness into a reason for gratitude. You have experienced this love, though you may not have recognized it at the time. Every door that closed just as you were about to walk through it, every opportunity that vanished at the last moment, every relationship that ended despite your efforts to save it, every business deal that fell apart despite perfect conditions. What felt like cruel fate was actually merciful protection. I want you to imagine a father watching his young son reach eagerly for a beautiful flame. The child sees only the dancing light, the mesmerizing glow, the warmth that draws him forward. But the father sees the burning, the scarring, the pain that would follow if the child grasps what he desires. What does love do in this moment? It pulls the child away from what he wants, and the child cries, not understanding that his tears are the sound of salvation. This is how God relates to us when we pursue prosperity that would destroy us. We see the glittering opportunity, the promising partnership, the lucrative deal. We stretch our hands toward what appears to be blessing, but our Heavenly Father sees the fire within the flame. He sees how achieving this particular success would corrupt our character, destroy our relationships, lead us into temptations we are not prepared to resist. So He pulls us back. He closes the door. He allows the opportunity to slip away. And we weep, not understanding that our disappointment is the sound of divine protection. I remember a season in my life when I was presented with an opportunity to expand my trade networks into regions I had never explored before. The potential for profit was enormous. The local rulers seemed eager to establish relationships. The terms being offered were extraordinarily favorable. Everything in my natural mind told me this was the breakthrough I had been waiting for. But something in my spirit felt uneasy. I could not identify the source of my discomfort, but I found myself hesitating when I should have been celebrating. My advisors pressed me to move quickly, warning that such opportunities might not come again. My own ambition demanded that I seize this moment before someone else did. Yet every time I moved to finalize the arrangements, obstacles would arise. Messengers would be delayed by storms. Critical documents would be lost in transit. Key officials would suddenly become unavailable. What should have been a straightforward negotiation became an endless series of complications and setbacks. Eventually, frustrated by the constant delays, I chose to withdraw from the opportunity entirely. Within months, I learned that the region I had been invited to invest in erupted into civil war. The rulers who had courted my partnership were overthrown and executed. The trade routes I had been promised access to were destroyed. Every merchant who had entered into agreements there lost not just their investments, but in many cases, their lives. What I had interpreted as divine opposition was actually divine protection. God had used delays, complications, and frustrations to save me from walking into a trap that would have cost me everything. The obstacles I had fought against were actually angels blocking my path to destruction. This is the pattern of divine love. It protects by appearing to withhold blessing. It saves by seeming to deny opportunity. It preserves by creating what feels like punishment. The very experiences that make us question God's goodness are often the clearest evidence of His care. But here is the deeper truth. God does not just protect us from external dangers. He protects us from ourselves, from what we might become if we achieved our desires without first developing the character to handle them responsibly. He sees not just what prosperity would do to our bank accounts, but what it would do to our souls. I have witnessed men receive exactly what they prayed for, only to watch it destroy them from the inside out. The business success that turned them into workaholics who lost their families. The financial windfall that made them suspicious of everyone around them. The recognition and fame that fed their pride until it consumed their humility. They got their wish, and it became their curse. This is why loss, from God's perspective, is often the kindest gift He can give. When He removes something from your life, He is not abandoning you to poverty or failure. He is removing whatever would have prevented you from becoming the man He created you to be. The withdrawal of prosperity is not punishment. It is preservation. The closing of doors is not rejection. It is redirection. The delay of success is not denial. It is development. God loves you too much to give you something that looks like a blessing but functions like a curse. This understanding changes how you respond to every setback, every disappointment, every moment when life does not unfold according to your plans. Instead of raging against circumstances you cannot control, you begin to trust the wisdom of a Father who sees what you cannot see, knows what you do not know, loves you more than you can imagine. The practical impact of this revelation is profound. When you truly believe that God's love is behind every loss, you stop wasting energy fighting against His protection. You begin to look for the lesson in every setback, the growth opportunity in every delay, the character development in every disappointment. You start asking different questions. Instead of, "Why is this happening to me?" you ask, "What is this protecting me from?" Instead of, "How can I get around this obstacle?" you ask, "What does God want me to learn before I move forward?" Instead of, "When will my breakthrough come?" you ask, "How is this season preparing me for what's ahead?" When loss is viewed through the lens of divine protection, gratitude becomes possible even in the midst of difficulty. You begin to thank God not just for what He gives, but for what He withholds. You praise Him not just for open doors, but for closed ones. You trust Him not just in seasons of blessing, but in seasons of apparent barrenness. The man who understands divine protection lives with unshakable peace, knowing that his loving Father will never allow him to grasp something that would ultimately harm him. He may not understand every delay, but he trusts the heart behind every decision. True prosperity comes to the man who has learned to see God's protective love in every loss, who can say with genuine faith, "If this door has closed, there must be a better one ahead." Number 5. Tribute rejected in the name of integrity. There are moments in every man's life when his character is tested by opportunity, when the very thing he desires most is offered to him at a price that would cost him everything he truly is. These are the defining moments, the crossroads where a man discovers whether his integrity is for sale or whether it is the one treasure he will never trade, no matter the offer. I faced such a moment when I was approached by a coalition of advisors and merchants who had devised what they presented as a perfect arrangement. They had identified lucrative opportunities in distant lands, partnerships that could multiply my wealth beyond imagination, deals that would establish my influence across continents. The gold they described was real, the opportunities genuine, the profits guaranteed. But there was a price. To secure these arrangements, I would need to overlook certain practices, approve certain policies, endorse certain decisions that I knew violated the principles of justice and mercy that I had built my reign upon. They assured me that these compromises were minor, that everyone in positions of power made such accommodations, that idealism was a luxury I could no longer afford if I truly wanted to prosper. The gold glittered before me like sunlight on water. I could see exactly how it would transform not just my own circumstances, but the entire kingdom. I could fund projects that had been delayed for years, provide benefits for my people that had remained dreams, establish a legacy that would outlast my lifetime. All I had to do was close my eyes to injustices I would not personally commit, but would profit from nonetheless. But as I contemplated this decision, I began to understand something that changed my entire perspective on prosperity. The same God who had granted me wisdom was now testing whether I valued that wisdom more than wealth. The same divine source that had blessed me with discernment was now asking whether I would use that discernment to choose character over cash. I realized that accepting this offer would not just compromise my integrity, it would demonstrate that I had never truly possessed integrity at all. If my principles could be purchased, then they were not principles but preferences, flexible according to the size of the offer. If my commitment to justice could be negotiated, then it was not commitment but convenience, abandoned whenever it became costly. The rejection of this tribute was one of the most difficult decisions of my reign, not because I doubted the right choice, but because I could see so clearly what I was giving up. I was not just refusing gold, I was refusing influence, power, expansion, the ability to fund dreams that I genuinely wanted to accomplish. I was choosing limitation when abundance was within reach, but I was also choosing something far more valuable than the wealth I rejected. I was choosing to remain the man I had worked to become rather than selling my soul to become someone I could no longer respect. I was choosing to maintain the trust of the God who had given me everything I possessed, rather than betraying that trust for things I could acquire through compromise. The consequences of this decision were immediate and painful. The opportunities I refused did not wait for me to change my mind. They went to other rulers who were willing to pay the price I was not. I watched from a distance as vast wealth flowed to men who had fewer scruples about how they earned it. I saw influence and power accumulate in the hands of those who were willing to trade integrity for advancement. For a time, I questioned whether I had made a mistake. Perhaps I had been too rigid, too idealistic, too unwilling to adapt to the realities of leadership and commerce. Perhaps the compromise would have been minor compared to the good I could have accomplished with the resources it would have provided. But as time passed, I began to see the wisdom in what I had chosen. The rulers who had accepted those tributes began to face consequences I had been protected from. Their compromises led to further compromises, each one easier to justify than the last. The injustices they had overlooked grew bolder, demanding more of their complicity. The partnerships they had formed began making demands that went far beyond the original arrangements. Within years, several of these rulers found themselves trapped in webs of corruption they could not escape. The wealth they had gained came with strings attached, and those strings became chains. They had traded temporary prosperity for permanent bondage, and the cost grew higher every year. I realized that God had not just given me the wisdom to refuse the tribute, He had also closed the door to protect me from becoming entangled in corruptions that would have ultimately destroyed me. The same divine power that had granted me discernment had also prevented me from using that discernment to rationalize compromise. This experience taught me that integrity is not just a moral luxury for those who can afford it. It is a practical necessity for those who want to build anything lasting. The man who compromises his character for prosperity gains money, but loses the very qualities that make him capable of managing money wisely. He may accumulate wealth, but he destroys the wisdom needed to preserve it. Moreover, I learned that God tests our integrity not to trap us, but to strengthen us. Every opportunity to compromise that we refuse makes us stronger in our convictions. Every temptation we resist increases our capacity to resist even greater temptations. Every time we choose character over cash, we become more worthy of both character and cash. The man who will not compromise his integrity for any amount of money is paradoxically the man most likely to be trusted with great wealth. People recognize authenticity, and they gravitate toward leaders whose principles are not negotiable. Opportunities come to those whose word is their bond, whose commitments are unshakable, whose character is beyond question. But even more importantly, the man who refuses to sell his integrity maintains his relationship with the God who is the source of all blessing. He may sacrifice immediate opportunities, but he preserves access to the divine wisdom, favor, and protection that are worth more than any earthly treasure. If you are facing pressure to compromise your principles for financial gain, if opportunities are being offered that require you to violate your convictions, remember this: the same God who allows these tests also provides the strength to pass them. He may close doors to protect you from corruptions that would cost you more than money could ever buy. The tribute you refuse in the name of integrity may seem like lost prosperity, but it is actually preserved dignity. And dignity, once lost, cannot be repurchased at any price. Number 6. Examples of princes who lost everything. Throughout my reign, I watched kingdoms rise and fall, and I observed how wealth and power reveal the true character of men. I have seen princes inherit vast territories and lose them within a generation, not through war or natural disaster, but through the cancer of pride that prosperity can feed when it finds a heart unprepared to contain it. There was a prince in a neighboring kingdom who inherited wealth so vast that counting it would have taken months. His father had been a wise ruler who built slowly, invested carefully, and treated prosperity as a sacred trust. But the son saw this inheritance differently. To him, wealth was not responsibility but validation, not stewardship but proof of his superiority over other men. Within the first year of his reign, this prince began to see himself as divine. He required subjects to prostrate themselves in his presence, not just as a sign of respect, but as acknowledgement of his godlike status. He commissioned monuments to his own greatness, statues that stood taller than temples, palaces that exceeded in luxury anything his ancestors had imagined. He spoke of his wealth not as blessing, but as evidence that the gods themselves had chosen him as their representative on earth. But prosperity, when it becomes an idol, demands increasingly expensive worship. The prince found that the admiration his wealth could buy was never enough to satisfy his ego. He needed greater displays, more extravagant gestures, increasingly elaborate demonstrations of his power. He began to spend not just his income, but the principal of his inheritance. He borrowed against future revenues to fund present indulgences. He taxed his people mercilessly to finance projects that served no purpose except to feed his pride. The people grew restless. The kingdom's resources were being drained for monuments that provided no benefit to anyone except their builder's ego. Trade relationships soured as neighboring rulers tired of dealing with someone who treated every negotiation as an opportunity to prove his superiority. Military leaders began to question orders that seemed designed more to impress than to protect. Meanwhile, the prince's arrogance blinded him to the growing opposition. He interpreted every criticism as jealousy, every warning as cowardice, every suggestion for moderation as evidence of his advisor's inability to comprehend his greatness. He surrounded himself with flatterers who told him what he wanted to hear, dismissing anyone who dared to speak truth to power. Within 5 years, civil war erupted. The prince's own military commanders led the rebellion, unable to watch their once prosperous kingdom being destroyed by one man's ego. The people supported the uprising, desperate to preserve what remained of their nation's wealth before it was entirely consumed by vanity projects. The prince died in battle, defending a palace built to glorify himself, fighting against subjects who had once respected his father's legacy. His vast inheritance was divided among rebel leaders. His monuments were torn down for building materials. His name became synonymous with the dangers of unchecked pride. Everything his father had built was lost, not to external enemies, but to internal corruption. I witnessed similar patterns throughout the region. Another prince inherited a thriving commercial empire, but began to see his wealth as proof that normal moral standards did not apply to him. He used his resources to indulge every appetite, to purchase every pleasure, to silence every conscience. He believed that his money made him immune to consequences, that his wealth could buy him exemption from the laws that governed ordinary men. This prince's corruption spread like poison through his administration. Officials learned that loyalty to the prince meant participating in his moral compromises. Justice became a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. The kingdom's reputation for fairness and integrity, built over generations, crumbled as stories of corruption spread to neighboring nations. Trade partners began to avoid dealing with a kingdom where contracts could be broken on the prince's whim, where agreements were valid only as long as they served his immediate interests. Investment dried up as merchants realized that their assets could be seized to fund the prince's excesses. The economic foundation of the kingdom began to crumble as trust, the cornerstone of all commerce, was destroyed. Within a decade, this prince found himself ruling over a nation in economic collapse. The wealth he had used to fund his indulgences was gone, but the corrupted systems he had created remained. Officials continued to steal, but now from a depleted treasury. Citizens who had learned to expect injustice lost faith in their government entirely. The kingdom that had once been a beacon of prosperity became a cautionary tale of decline. These princes fell because they made prosperity into an idol, and no idol can survive the scrutiny of truth. When wealth becomes the measure of worth, when money becomes the source of identity, when riches become the foundation of self-image, then the loss of wealth becomes the collapse of everything. The man who builds his sense of self on his bank account creates a structure that cannot survive financial storms. But there is a deeper principle at work in these tragedies. God himself withdrew prosperity from these men because he saw that it had become a source of spiritual destruction. Their wealth was not serving its intended purpose of enabling service and building community. Instead, it was feeding pride, enabling corruption, and destroying the very qualities that make leadership possible. The Almighty allowed their kingdoms to fall not as punishment, but as prevention. He removed their ability to do further damage, both to themselves and to the people under their authority. Their loss of wealth was actually a mercy, both for them and for their subjects, though few recognized it as such at the time. The The lesson is clear. Prosperity that feeds pride will ultimately be withdrawn by the one who gave it. Wealth that becomes an idol will be removed by the God who tolerates no rivals. Power that corrupts its holder will be transferred to someone who can use it more responsibly. But there is hope in this pattern. The God who withdraws prosperity from those who abuse it is the same God who grants it to those who can handle it with wisdom and humility. The key is not to avoid wealth, but to maintain the character that makes one worthy of wealth. The prince who sees his prosperity as stewardship rather than ownership, who uses his resources to serve rather than to dominate, who remains humble despite his abundance, such a man can maintain his wealth because his wealth serves rather than enslaves him. If you find yourself tempted to use prosperity to feed pride, remember these fallen princes. Their wealth could not save them from the consequences of their character, but character, once developed, can both attract and preserve prosperity for generations. Number 7. The revealing test of withdrawn prosperity. When prosperity is suddenly withdrawn from a man's life, something profound and terrible and necessary occurs. All the facades crumble, all the pretenses fall away, and what remains is the raw truth of what he has built his life upon. This moment of loss is not punishment, it is revelation. It strips away everything non-essential and exposes the foundation upon which he has constructed his identity, his security, his sense of purpose and worth. You may be living through this test right now, watching as income streams that once seemed permanent dry up, as investments that appeared secure crumble, as opportunities that felt certain evaporate before your eyes. If so, then you are facing one of the most important examinations of your life, a test that will reveal not just your financial situation, but the condition of your soul. This test asks the most fundamental question a man can face. When everything you have worked for is threatened, when everything you have accumulated begins to disappear, where do you find your strength? What remains when wealth is gone? Who are you when you have nothing left to show for your efforts? The answer to these questions will determine not just how you survive this season, but what kind of man you become through it. Because there are only two possible foundations upon which a man can build his life: the shifting sands of material prosperity, or the solid rock of wisdom and faith. When the storms of loss come, and they come to every man eventually, only one of these foundations will hold. I have seen men who built their entire sense of self upon their ability to accumulate wealth, and when that wealth was withdrawn, they collapsed completely. Their depression was not just about money, it was about identity. Their despair was not just financial, it was existential. They had no idea who they were, apart from what they owned. So when ownership was threatened, they faced not just poverty but the complete dissolution of their sense of self. These men become dangerous in their desperation. They make increasingly reckless decisions, trying to restore what they have lost. They compromise their integrity, attempting to rebuild their wealth quickly. They sacrifice relationships in pursuit of financial recovery. They become bitter, angry, jealous of others' success, convinced that life has treated them unfairly. The test reveals that their foundation was sand, and now they are sinking. But I have also witnessed men face the same test and respond completely differently. When their wealth was withdrawn, they certainly experienced pain, disappointment, and concern about practical matters. But they did not lose their essential selves, because their essential selves were not built upon their bank accounts. They had cultivated wisdom, character, relationships, and faith that transcended their financial circumstances. These men view the loss of prosperity as a challenge to overcome rather than a verdict on their worth. They see setbacks as temporary rather than permanent. They maintain their integrity because their integrity was never dependent on their ability to afford it. They preserve their relationships because their relationships were not built on what they could provide financially. They continue to trust God because their trust was not conditional on continuous blessing. The test reveals that their foundation was rock, and though they may bend under pressure, they do not break. I remember when this test came to my own life with particular intensity. A series of failed investments, political upheavals, and natural disasters combined to threaten a significant portion of my wealth. Projects I had funded for years suddenly required massive additional investment or would collapse entirely. Trading relationships that had been profitable for decades became financial drains. Even my legendary wisdom seemed inadequate to navigate the complexity of crises that were overwhelming my kingdom simultaneously. In the darkest moment of this season, I found myself alone in my chambers, forced to confront the possibility that I might lose a substantial portion of everything I had built. The practical concerns were real and serious, but what surprised me was that they were not the source of my greatest anxiety. My deepest fear was not poverty, but the possibility that, without wealth to validate my decisions and choices, I might discover that my confidence, my peace, my sense of purpose had all been dependent on prosperity rather than on wisdom. This was the moment of truth, when I had to discover what remained when money was threatened, and what I found both humbled and strengthened me. My worth as a man was not diminished by financial loss because it had never been dependent on financial gain. My wisdom was not less valuable because it was not currently producing profit. My relationship with God was not weakened because He was allowing me to face difficulties. In fact, I discovered that adversity was revealing strengths I had not known I possessed, teaching me lessons that prosperity had been unable to provide, deepening my character in ways that blessing alone could never accomplish. The foundation I had built on wisdom and faith was proving solid enough to support me even when the prosperity built upon it was shaking. This revelation transformed how I viewed not just my current crisis, but every future challenge. I realized that the man whose foundation is secure can face any storm with confidence, not because he knows the outcome, but because he knows he can survive whatever the outcome might be. The man whose identity transcends his circumstances cannot be destroyed by changes in those circumstances. But here is the most important insight from this test. God often withdraws prosperity not to destroy us, but to reveal to us the strength of our true foundation. He removes the temporary so we can appreciate the eternal. He takes away the external so we can discover the internal. He allows financial insecurity so we can find spiritual security. The man who passes this test emerges stronger than before, not because he has regained his wealth, but because he has proven to himself that he can thrive without it. He becomes anti-fragile, improved by difficulty rather than damaged by it. He develops an unshakable confidence that comes not from his ability to accumulate, but from his ability to endure. When prosperity eventually returns to such a man, and it usually does, it serves him rather than enslaving him. He uses it as a tool rather than worshiping it as an idol. He enjoys it without being dependent on it. He shares it freely because he knows his security does not depend on hoarding it. If you are facing the test of withdrawn prosperity right now, ask yourself these crucial questions. What remains when wealth is threatened? Where do you find strength when money fails? Who are you when you have nothing left to prove? Your answers will determine not just how you survive this season, but what kind of man you become through it. Number 8. The most humiliating lesson. Nothing truly belongs to us. There is a moment in every man's journey when the illusion of ownership is shattered completely, when the comfortable fiction that he possesses anything at all is stripped away, leaving him face to face with the humbling truth that he is merely a steward of borrowed blessings. This moment is perhaps the most essential and the most devastating lesson a man can learn, and it often comes through loss rather than gain. For most of my life, I spoke confidently of my wealth, my kingdom, my achievements, as if these things were extensions of my very being, as if I had somehow created them from nothing through my own power and wisdom. I took pride in what I had accumulated, drew identity from what I possessed, made plans based on the assumption that what I held today would remain in my hands tomorrow. I was living in a carefully constructed delusion, and God, in His mercy, could not allow me to continue in such dangerous self-deception. The revelation came not through a single dramatic loss, but through a gradual awakening to reality that was both gentle and devastating. It began when I started to truly observe the temporary nature of all earthly things. The magnificent palaces I had built would eventually crumble. The vast wealth I had accumulated would eventually be distributed to others. The wisdom I had gained would die with me unless I passed it on. Even my own body, which I considered mine more than anything else, was aging and would eventually return to dust. But the deeper revelation was not about the temporary nature of things, but about the fundamental relationship between creator and creation. I began to understand that everything I had considered mine had actually been entrusted to me by the same God who had given me life itself. I was not an owner, but a manager, not a possessor, but a steward, not a creator of wealth, but a temporary guardian of resources that belonged ultimately to their true source. This understanding was profoundly humiliating to a man who had taken great pride in his accomplishments. It meant that every success I had celebrated as evidence of my greatness was actually evidence of God's goodness. Every wise decision I had made had been possible only because I had been given wisdom from above. Every opportunity I had seized had been provided by a divine providence I had rarely acknowledged. The humiliation deepened as I realized how I had been taking credit for gifts I had been given, how I had been proud of achievements that had been made possible by grace, how I had been hoarding resources that had never belonged to me in the first place. I was like a servant who had been entrusted with his master's household and had begun to act as if he were the master himself. This recognition completely transformed my relationship with loss. When I understood that nothing truly belonged to me, I also understood that nothing could truly be taken from me, because I had never possessed it to begin with. God was not stealing from me when he withdrew prosperity. He was simply redistributing his own resources according to his wisdom and timing. The most difficult aspect of this lesson was accepting that this principle applied not just to material possessions, but to everything I held dear. My family, my health, my reputation, my influence, even my life itself. All were temporary gifts entrusted to my care, rather than permanent possessions I could claim as my own. This meant that loss, in any form, was not an attack on my rights, but simply the normal flow of divine stewardship. I remember the specific night when this truth penetrated my heart completely. I had been walking through my palace, observing the treasures I had collected from around the world, the architectural marvels I had commissioned, the artistic masterpieces I had acquired. Instead of feeling the usual pride in my possessions, I found myself overwhelmed by the recognition that none of it was actually mine. Every gold ornament had been created from materials drawn from the earth that belonged to God. Every precious stone had been formed over millennia by processes I had not initiated or controlled. Every work of art had been created by talents that were themselves divine gifts. Even the wisdom I had used to acquire these treasures had been given to me, not earned by me. I was surrounded by wonders that testified not to my greatness, but to the generosity of the one who had allowed me to enjoy them temporarily. This recognition brought both devastation and liberation. Devastation because it destroyed my pride, my sense of personal achievement, my feeling of being special because of what I possessed. But liberation because it freed me from the anxiety of protecting what was never mine to begin with, from the fear of losing what I could never truly own, from the pressure of maintaining what had always been dependent on divine grace rather than human effort. When you truly accept that nothing belongs to you, several profound changes occur in how you relate to prosperity. First, you become grateful rather than proud. Instead of congratulating yourself on your achievements, you thank God for his gifts. Instead of taking credit for your success, you acknowledge the grace that made it possible. Second, you become generous rather than possessive. When you understand that your wealth is not yours but has been entrusted to you, sharing becomes not a sacrifice but a responsibility. You are not giving away your money. You are distributing God's resources according to his purposes. Third, you become peaceful rather than anxious. The man who knows that his security depends not on what he owns but on the faithfulness of the one who owns everything can rest in circumstances that would terrify someone who believes his welfare depends on his possessions. Fourth, you become willing to accept God's redistribution of his resources without bitterness. When prosperity is withdrawn, you can recognize it as divine stewardship rather than personal attack. God is not taking something from you. He is moving his own resources according to his wisdom. This lesson transformed how I viewed every aspect of leadership and wealth management. I began to see myself as a temporary custodian of resources that would eventually be passed to others. This perspective made me more careful about how I used what had been entrusted to me, more intentional about leaving a positive legacy, more focused on developing systems and principles that would outlast my own tenure. The practical impact of this understanding cannot be overstated. The man who truly grasps that he owns nothing, is paradoxically the man most capable of managing wealth wisely. He makes decisions based on stewardship principles rather than ownership emotions. He takes calculated risks because he knows his ultimate security does not depend on any single outcome. He shares freely because he knows that generosity flows from abundance that he could never exhaust through his own efforts. If you are struggling with loss, if you find it difficult to accept changes in your circumstances, if you feel angry when prosperity is withdrawn, then perhaps God is trying to teach you this most humiliating and liberating truth. Nothing truly belongs to you, and in that reality lies the secret to unshakable peace. When you can say with genuine acceptance, "The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." You have learned the lesson that transforms every loss into a lesson in trust, every setback into an opportunity for growth, every withdrawal of prosperity into evidence of divine love. Number 9. Loss as the seed of maturity. In the economy of the soul, loss functions as the most potent catalyst for growth, the harsh but necessary teacher that transforms boys into men and immature men into wise leaders. What appears to be destruction is actually construction. What feels like ending is actually beginning. What seems like punishment is actually preparation for a level of strength and wisdom that prosperity alone could never produce. You have felt this truth even if you have not recognized it. The greatest growth spurts of your life have not come during seasons of ease and abundance, but during times of challenge and loss. The decisions that shaped your character were not made when everything was going well, but when you were forced to choose between what was easy and what was right. The insights that transformed your perspective came not from success, but from failure that taught you lessons success could never provide. I want you to understand something that will change how you view every difficulty in your life. God does not allow loss despite His love for you, but because of His love for you. He knows that certain qualities can only be developed under pressure. Certain strengths can only be discovered in adversity. Certain wisdom can only be gained through the experience of having something precious taken away. Consider the process by which precious metals are refined. Gold in its raw state is mixed with impurities that make it weak and unstable. To reveal the pure gold within, it must be subjected to intense heat that burns away everything that is not truly gold. The fire does not destroy the gold, it reveals it. The heat does not damage the metal, it purifies it. What appears to be a destructive process is actually a creative one. This is how God uses loss in the life of a man. He subjects us to the heat of adversity not to harm us, but to burn away the impurities in our character that make us weak and unstable. Pride, selfishness, entitlement, dependence on external validation, fear of vulnerability, these character flaws cannot be removed through prosperity. They can only be exposed and eliminated through the refining fire of loss. I learned this lesson through a season of my life when it seemed that everything I touched turned to failure. Business ventures that should have succeeded collapsed without explanation. Relationships I had invested years in building dissolved over seemingly minor disagreements. Plans I had made with confidence and enthusiasm were thwarted by circumstances beyond my control. For months, it felt as if I was walking through a desert where nothing would grow, where every effort was futile, where every hope was disappointed. My initial response was anger and self-pity. I questioned God's faithfulness, wondered if I had done something to deserve this treatment, felt abandoned by the same divine providence that had previously blessed my efforts so abundantly. I focused on what I was losing rather than what I might be learning. I fought against the circumstances rather than looking for the growth they might be producing. But gradually, as the season of difficulty extended, I began to notice changes occurring within me that would never have happened during times of success. My dependence on God deepened because I had nowhere else to turn. My empathy for others increased because I was experiencing struggles I had previously only observed. My gratitude for small blessings intensified because I could no longer take abundance for granted. Most importantly, I began to discover strengths I never knew I possessed. The comfortable life I had been living had not required much courage, much persistence, much faith, but adversity demanded all of these qualities and more. I found that I could endure more than I had thought possible, that I could maintain hope in circumstances that would have once devastated me, that I could find peace even when prosperity seemed permanently out of reach. The man who emerged from that season of loss was fundamentally different from the one who had entered it. Not different in his circumstances, which eventually improved, but different in his character, which had been refined and strengthened. I had learned lessons about myself, about God, about life, that no amount of prosperity could have taught me. The loss had indeed been the seed of maturity. This process is not accidental or arbitrary. God engineers seasons of loss specifically to produce growth that cannot occur any other way. He allows us to fail so we can learn persistence. He permits discouragement so we can develop faith. He withdraws external support so we can discover internal resources. He takes away what we want so we can appreciate what we need. But here is the crucial insight. Loss only produces maturity in those who respond to it correctly. The same circumstances that mature one man can embitter another. The same setbacks that strengthen one person can weaken someone else. The difference lies not in the circumstances themselves, but in how we choose to interpret and respond to them. The man who sees loss as punishment will become bitter. The man who sees loss as abandonment will become hopeless. The man who sees loss as random misfortune will become cynical. But the man who recognizes loss as divine education will become wise. The man who views setbacks as preparation will become strong. The man who understands that God sometimes takes away what we have in order to give us what we need will become mature. This maturity has practical implications that extend far beyond emotional or spiritual development. The man who has been refined by loss becomes exponentially more capable of handling prosperity when it returns. He no longer takes success for granted because he remembers what failure taught him. He manages resources more carefully because he has experienced scarcity. He treats opportunities with greater respect because he has lived through seasons when opportunities were rare. Moreover, the character developed through loss creates a magnetism that attracts both people and opportunities. Others sense the depth that comes from having survived difficulty. They trust the judgment of someone who has been tested. They want to partner with someone whose character has been proven under pressure. The very losses that seem to set you back often become the credentials that open doors to greater opportunities. But the greatest benefit of loss transformed into maturity is the unshakable confidence it produces. The man who has discovered that he can survive the loss of what he thought he needed most badly develops a security that no external circumstances can threaten. He knows that whatever happens, he has the inner resources to handle it. He has been to the bottom and found that he could climb back up. This knowledge makes him virtually indestructible. If you are currently experiencing loss, if life seems to be taking away more than it is giving, if you feel like you are being refined in a fire that is almost too hot to bear, take courage in this truth. God is not finished with you. He is preparing you. He is developing qualities in you that will serve you for the rest of your life. The loss you are experiencing today is the seed of the maturity you will possess tomorrow. The question is not whether you will survive this season, but whether you will allow it to mature you. Will you fight against the process or cooperate with it? Will you focus on what you are losing or what you are gaining? Will you see yourself as a victim of circumstances or as a student in God's school of character development? The man who can answer these questions correctly will emerge from his season of loss not just recovered, but transformed. He will be not just restored to where he was, but elevated to where he was meant to be. The seed of maturity planted in loss will bear fruit that will bless not just his own life, but the lives of everyone he touches. Number 10. The true revelation about prosperity. After decades of pursuing wealth, accumulating riches, and wrestling with the complexities of prosperity, I have arrived at a revelation that changes everything. This truth is so fundamental that it reframes not just how we think about money, but how we understand our entire purpose on earth. The revelation is this: prosperity is not about always having more, but about becoming worthy of what has been entrusted to us. This understanding shatters the modern obsession with accumulation for its own sake. It challenges the assumption that success means continuously increasing wealth. It exposes the emptiness of measuring progress by bank account balances rather than character development. It reveals that the question God asks is not, "How much have you gathered?" but "What have you become through what I have given you?" You see, There is a fundamental difference between the man who seeks wealth to possess it and the man who develops character to deserve it. The first man approaches prosperity as a consumer, always hungry for more, never satisfied with what he has, constantly comparing his accumulations to those of others. The second man approaches prosperity as a steward, recognizing that his primary responsibility is not to gather resources but to become worthy of managing them effectively. This distinction changes everything about how a man pursues and handles wealth. When the goal is accumulation, there is no logical stopping point. No amount is ever enough, because the hunger only grows with feeding. Every gain feels temporary, because it could always be more. Every loss feels catastrophic, because it reduces the total that defines worth. But when the goal is worthiness, a different dynamic emerges. The focus shifts from what you can get to who you can become. Success is measured not by how much you accumulate, but by how well you manage what you receive. Growth occurs not just in wealth but in wisdom, not just in possessions but in character, not just in what you own but in who you are. I learned this lesson through observing my own relationship with wealth over many years. In my youth, I was driven by the desire to have more than anyone else, to possess treasures that would set me apart, to accumulate wealth that would prove my superiority. I measured my progress by comparing my riches to those of other rulers, and I was never satisfied because there was always someone somewhere who possessed something I did not have. But as I matured, I began to notice that the men I most respected were not necessarily the wealthiest, but those who handled wealth with the greatest wisdom. They were generous without being wasteful, prosperous without being ostentatious, successful without being proud. They used money as a tool rather than treasuring it as an idol. They seemed to possess their wealth rather than being possessed by it. Studying these men, I realized that they had learned to see prosperity as a test rather than a reward. They understood that God gives resources not as a prize for achievement, but as an examination of character. The question being asked through every blessing received is, can you be trusted with this? Will you use it wisely? Does having it make you a better man or a worse one? This perspective transforms the entire experience of both gaining and losing wealth. When prosperity comes, instead of feeling entitled to it, you feel honored by the trust it represents. Instead of using it to prove your worth, you use it to demonstrate your reliability. Instead of hoarding it for security, you deploy it for purpose. When prosperity is withdrawn, instead of feeling punished, you examine what the loss might be teaching you. Instead of demanding its return, you ask what needs to change in your character before you can be trusted with it again. Instead of becoming bitter about what you have lost, you become grateful for what the loss has revealed about areas where you need to grow. I remember the specific moment when this revelation crystallized for me. I was reviewing the accounts of my kingdom, and instead of feeling pride in the vast wealth under my management, I felt overwhelmed by the responsibility it represented. I realized that I would eventually give an account for how I had used every resource entrusted to me. The question would not be whether I had accumulated much, but whether I had managed well what I had been given. This understanding made me more careful about my spending, more intentional about my investments, more thoughtful about my generosity. It also made me more peaceful about fluctuations in my wealth because I understood that my worth was not determined by my net worth, but by my faithfulness in stewardship. The practical implications of this revelation are profound. The man who pursues worthiness instead of accumulation makes completely different decisions. He invests in character development as much as in financial instruments. He views education and wisdom as forms of wealth that can never be stolen. He prioritizes relationships that will last over possessions that will perish. He measures success by impact rather than income. This man also handles setbacks differently. When investments fail, he asks what the failure can teach him about better decision-making. When opportunities are withdrawn, he examines whether he was prepared to handle them responsibly. When prosperity decreases, he considers whether the decrease is protecting him from corruption or preparing him for greater responsibility. But the most liberating aspect of this revelation is that it removes the artificial ceiling that most men place on their contentment. When the goal is always having more, satisfaction is impossible because more is infinite. But when the goal is being worthy, satisfaction becomes achievable because worthiness has recognizable markers. The man who has developed integrity, wisdom, generosity, and faithfulness can rest in the knowledge that he has achieved something far more valuable than wealth. He has become someone worthy of wealth. This does not mean accepting poverty or abandoning ambition. Rather, it means pursuing prosperity from a foundation of character rather than a foundation of greed. It means seeking wealth not for what it can do for your ego, but for what you can do with it for others. It means viewing every dollar as a tool to be used rather than a trophy to be displayed. When prosperity eventually returns to the man who has become worthy of it, and it almost always does, it serves a completely different function. It no longer defines his identity, because his identity was developed independently of his wealth. It no longer creates anxiety, because he knows that his security comes from his character rather than his cash. It no longer isolates him because he uses it to serve others rather than to elevate himself above them. If God has withdrawn prosperity from your life, if you are wondering when it will return, if you are frustrated by the delay in your financial breakthrough, consider this possibility. He may not be withholding blessing because he wants to harm you, but because he wants to prepare you. He may be using this season not to punish you, but to develop in you the character necessary to handle greater responsibility. The man who embraces this process, who focuses on becoming worthy rather than just becoming wealthy, often discovers that worthiness itself attracts prosperity. People trust him with opportunities because they recognize his character. God blesses him with resources because he sees that they will be used wisely. Success comes not as a reward for grasping, but as a natural consequence of being prepared. True prosperity flows to those who have proven themselves worthy of it, and worthiness cannot be purchased. It can only be developed through the very experiences of loss and limitation that we naturally want to avoid. Tonight, when you lay your head upon your pillow, I want you to imagine a tree that has grown for decades in rich soil, its branches heavy with fruit, its roots deep and strong. But the wise gardener sees that the tree has grown dependent on artificial nutrients, that its natural strength is weakening, that the very abundance that seems like blessing is slowly poisoning its core. So the gardener withdraws the artificial feeding, and for a season, the tree struggles. Its leaves may yellow, its fruit may be less abundant, its growth may seem to pause, but something profound is happening beneath the surface. The roots are being forced to go deeper, to find the natural sources of nourishment they had forgotten how to seek. The tree is learning to draw strength from sources that will never fail, never run out, never be withdrawn by any external force. You are that tree, and this season you are walking through is not your ending, it is your deepening. Every door that closes is forcing your roots to go deeper. Every opportunity that slips away is teaching you to find sources of strength you never knew existed. Every moment when prosperity seems to avoid you is actually an invitation to discover the prosperity that can never be taken away. The man who understands this lives in a different reality than those around him. He moves through the world knowing that his true wealth is being developed in places that market crashes cannot touch, that his real security is being built on foundations that no external force can shake. If these words are stirring something in your spirit, if you sense that there are deeper truths waiting to be discovered, then join me on this journey of understanding. There are revelations that can only be shared with those who are ready to hear them. Insights that can only be received by hearts that have been prepared through their own seasons of questioning. The man who has learned to see God's love in every loss has learned to see the world as it truly is.